Hello, YouTube. A lot of Americans are wondering why so many people are out on the streets chanting free, free Palestine. Now I'm going to begin to answer the question in this short video. A long time ago, I met up with a Buddhist monk and he told me I should always have a seeking mind. Well, sometimes I fall asleep with my iPad on and YouTube's playing. In the middle of the night, a couple of nights ago, I woke up to this video and I've put a link to it in the description. And I was having a nightmare about it. Now, most Westerners won't listen to this video that I put a link to in the description because it sounds scary. And it's because we've had this narrative our whole lives that somehow we're the good guys and everyone else are the bad guys, especially the ones with Middle Eastern accents. Now, most of us don't know the language and we've been brainwashed to believe this language they're speaking sounds like death to America. I get it, and it's scary to me too, because I don't know what the fuck they're saying either, especially the beginning of the video where the guy is up there singing a recitation of the Quran. But if I'm going to have a seeking mind, it means I have to be willing to listen to what others have to say about challenging the Zionist narrative of Palestine. This video that I put a link to in the description was live streamed on June 5th, 2021, just a little over 2 years ago. This was before October 7th and before the media started bullshitting us again. You can listen to the full video and the link is in the description, but I'd like to just summarize it for you because like you, I'm trying to get at the truth. And I know that most of us in the West won't get past the first 8 minutes without turning it off. That's just the way it is. But I invite you to give this a listen because it is important. Maybe you'll do it because I have an American voice and I'm introducing it. It's the least I can do to make this video, and the least you can do is give it a listen. The truth so often is hard to hear sometimes, especially if you've been fed lies your whole life. I'm hoping that you'll give this information your consideration, and if my introduction causes you to do that, then I've done my part. Now, the first speaker is a renowned Palestinian scholar named Mustafa Abu Sway, and he sheds some light on historical facts based on his experience and knowledge. Next up is a resident scholar of EPIC. It's the East Plano Islamic Center in Plano, Texas. His name is Sheikh Dr. Yasser Qadi. I know I'm pronouncing these names terribly, but he asks us to consider 5 questions and says it is with the knowledge of this history that we have the best weapons and tools to take on the Zionist narrative and the myth. He suggests that any neutral observer cannot help but not be astonished by the blatant arrogance and the trampling of human rights by the global superpowers. The first question is, what gave the United Kingdom, Britain, the right to promise Palestine to a group of Europeans involved in the Zionist movement at the turn of the century? England didn't own this land, nor did the Europeans they promised it to have anything to do with it in recent history. Our own country of America broke away from England because they taxed our tea. Privately, the British promised the Arabs independence from the Ottomans if they rebelled against the Ottoman Caliphate. Then they said to the Sharif of Mecca that if you fight against your fellow Muslims and you fight against the Ottomans, we will make you the owner of this land. So on the 5th of June in 1916, the Sharif of Mecca attacked the Ottoman Empire, and he started the attack in Medina with the idea they would have Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. The whole thing would be theirs. England, meanwhile, had a secret agreement with France and Russia, who were the superpowers, and it was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They even had a map. Palestine would be independent. Nobody would have power over it. Then they had another secret agreement called the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the foreign minister of England promised Lord Balfour, the representative of the World Zionist Federation, that if they helped them in World War I, that they would hand Palestine over to the Zionists. Zionism was a European project started by secular, which means not religious Jews, in 1897. Religious Jews across the world rejected this agreement, American Jews in particular were not supportive of it at all. Because of the rise of the Nazis, Zionism gained traction. So again, what gave England the right to do this? At the turn of the century, Jews made up 3% of the population of Palestine, and they were Jewish Arabs. Jewish Arabs, Muslims, and Christians were living side by side until the Zionist project begins. Europeans at the time did not consider Arabs as equal. The second question he says we should ask is, what gave the United Nations the right to take the Balfour Declaration and make that part of their resolution without consulting people who lived there? The United Nations was a newly formed body after World War II, and in one of its earliest resolutions, number 181, in 1947, without consulting the Arabs and with no concern over what the Palestinians had to say about it, the resolution divided Palestine into 3 separate areas. 55% to Jewish Zionists, and 45% was given to the local Arabs, and Jerusalem was allocated to nobody. The third question, he says, is what gave the newly founded state of Israel in August 1948 the right to immediately force 1 million farmers and peasants from their land and take over 80% of Palestine? Did you know that over 450 villages were wiped out, even though the Zionist government said the land was empty? This was called the first catastrophe, the Nefka. The fourth question he asks is, what gave the Zionists the right to launch another attack in 1967, the Six-Day War, when they took over Gaza and took over the entire West Bank, and they invaded East Jerusalem too? By the way, that war also began on June 5th, 1967. What a coincidence. This was called the Second Nefka. The United Nations did nothing. The fifth and last question he asks is, by what right does the government of Israel have to treat the Palestinians in a manner that no government on earth treats any other people? They basically have had the people in Gaza in an armed camp since 1967. Gaza had been called an open-air prison, and Israel controls everything. Next up is a lecturer from UC Berkeley. His name's Professor Hatim Bassin. He says the problem in Palestine isn't a communications problem. He also says it isn't a problem of occupation. He says Palestine is the last settler colonial project to be commissioned by Western powers in order to create a colonial outpost in Palestine. He talks about the 6 features of settler colonization. He also mentions that the American Indians were transferred onto reservations in the same way that the Palestinians were sent to refugee camps. In other words, we look at the world through our Eurocentric lens. The British, Germans, and Americans did archaeological research to support the biblical claims. In other words, they came up with the conclusion first, and any evidence that didn't support it was thrown out. So as early as 1865, the British had a whole mapping underway to support the biblical texts. Did you know that most Zionists don't even believe in God, but they believe that God gave them the land? Strange. The history of Palestine does not begin with the Bible. The oldest olive tree in the world is in Palestine, and it's been traced back 6,500 years. There's no dispute that the early Jewish community was in Palestine in 1000 BC. However, the longest rule of Palestine is actually the Egyptians. The oldest wall in Jerusalem dates back further than the Bible. So when Abraham came to Palestine, it was already a thriving community. Christian Zionism doesn't recognize that. They only recognize the biblical interpretation. It's very interesting, and I encourage you to watch the full video. The Oslo Agreement in 1993 brought the PLO to reconstitute colonial power over Palestine, to preserve the colonial status of Palestine by having them pretend to represent them. The last speaker was Mike Peled. He's the author of a book called The General's Son. and his father was a general in the Israeli High Command. He shares the minutes of the meetings with the generals who started the Six-Day War in 1967, which they claim to have started against Egypt and its Arab neighbors, not because there was an existential threat, but instead they just wanted the opportunity to destroy Palestine. He says the Zionists don't rest, and they press on with their agenda to rid the place of Palestinians. It's really disgusting. He said you could be sitting in an Israeli settlement and see the smoke and see the bombs falling on Gaza and get the impression that Israel is under attack and they're just defending themselves. Defending themselves against what? 2 million people, more than half of them refugees, homeless, being bombed with no access to water, no access to medical care. These people's homes are not in the Gaza Strip. They all came from somewhere else, and the obvious thing to do is to let them go home. Israel doesn't want that, though. The formula is to kill them and then blame them for it. Kill them and then say it's because they're terrorists. As crazy as it sounds, the rest of the world just says, okay, that's fine. Kill them because they're terrorists. And then when they shoot a rocket into Israel, they say, see, they're terrorists. It's crazy. So Israel has the right to defend itself, but Palestinians don't. Listen for yourself, and you might understand why people are in the streets saying, free, free Palestine. Those of us that know these things need to speak up, and that's why I made this video, to speak up. If you speak up, though, you're told you're anti-Semitic. But the reality is the state of Israel is a racist regime that has taken over Palestine, and most of the Israeli people oppose the Zionists, just like the average American opposes the United States having military bases all over the world. Just like most San Franciscans oppose the idea that rents in San Francisco are 3 times as much as what the average worker can afford. It's time to speak up, and it's time to change. One last thing. President Biden says he's a Zionist, and he's proud of it. And President Trump isn't saying anything much different than that. It's time to wake up. So listen to the video in the description, and I'm going to go back to bed. One further note. This week in San Francisco, we're having the APEC conference, and they've put all these fences up all over the place. It's turned into a police state. It's really shocking to watch. Anyway, thanks for listening, and please do watch the video in the description. It'll really open your eyes.